Hello, we have Bob Dignen again with us, joining today for the fourth session. Thank you for joining, Bob.
Pleasure to be here.
And today's topic is cross-border communication skills. So, Bob, what can we talk about? I know in the last session we talked about culture. I mean, we covered culture in 2 consecutive sessions, because it was such an important and complex concept. But today we'll kind of more focus on the communication aspect and communication between different cultures and different people. So what do you think? What are the main challenges when it comes to communication between people and culture?
Okay, I mean, we use the term cross-border communication, and as always, I like to explore terminology. Mm-hmm. Cross-border can mean very different things. It can mean across cultures, it can mean international, and of course, that within those terms, you also have face-to-face, sitting in the same room, which is one form of cross-cultural or international communication, and then sitting in different continents, communicating either by email or by phone. So cross-border has many, many different dimensions and manifestations, and of course, ultimately, cross-border also refers to the challenge of communicating across egos, across psychologies, across personalities. So in the end, all human interaction is a form of cross-border communication.
Absolutely.
And all human interaction, all human beings struggle to communicate. So we're dealing on the one hand with international and intercultural, but on the other hand, I think the moment you start to look at the cross-border, you realize you're dealing with human fundamentals at a very deep level.
Absolutely. And I think that's absolutely spot on, because we do have, even within the same culture, even within the same communities, and even professionals who have similar backgrounds, similar kind of experiences, have challenges communicating, because you can even classify that as cross-borders. As soon as you start communicating with someone else, you will have those kind of challenges. So
it's a very fundamental subject. I mean, as you and I work with people working in projects, when you ask about project failure or project challenge, one of the words which comes to people's lips first is communication. It's generally not how to design a work breakdown structure or how to do a business case. It's somehow the human interaction that people find very, very challenging. So I think talking about communication is really talking about the hardcore and the hard work of projects.
Absolutely. And so Bob, what makes communication so challenging? Why do we find it so difficult to do?
Yeah, I think a lot of the challenges with communication derive. Well, I think we firstly have to go back to some of our assumptions about what we mean by communication and what we believe we can achieve by communication. I think one of the major challenges for expert adult professionals is that they believe that making a noise, speaking, is equivalent to communicating, and they also make the assumption that hearing the noises of another human being is equivalent to understanding and listening effectively. And I think there is a huge underestimation of the complexity of the process of communication, and people are generally viewing communication way too simplistically and underestimating its challenge. And at another more provocative level, we might even argue that communication is an impossibility. And that's an interesting position to take. That we might argue that to get your message across to another human being is an impossibility. Communication is not possible, because that requires a level of intersubjectivity which is simply not physically possible, because we are two physical entities. And it may seem a rather bizarre and extreme position to take, but if we take that position, that communication is never achievable, it's quite useful, because it makes us think about communication much more carefully and strategically. I mean, I don't know whether you ever thought in that way, that communication as an impossibility.
I mean, probably not to that extreme that it's an impossibility, because I still want to have that notion of hope that we can get our message across. But it is, I think, I definitely agree with you that if we do look at it from that angle, we become more strategic and more aware of how we're communicating to increase the effectiveness, or at least approach a level of not perfection, but I always kind of give the analogy of an asymptote and approaching. So when you say impossible, so the possibility of complete or accurate communication is never achieved, but you can approach it. So the more strategic you are, the closer you can get, but maybe not exactly hit that point. So
yes, I think we can still argue we can communicate well or badly, and then the issue is what constitutes bad and what constitutes good. And I think good communication at the end of the day is at a certain level of balance between. I think we mentioned before, it's about a balance between speaking, remaining silent, and asking questions. That's at a very, very basic level. But I think it's a useful level to draw out, because my impression is most people underuse the third dimension, the use of questioning as a communication tool, which has a host of values. We said before, it communicates respect for the other person, it generates and stimulates learning and opens up the ability to provide support. It can also be used as a weapon, but of course if it's used positively, intentioned positively, I think at a very basic level, good communication needs a very careful balance of those three dimensions. And across cultures, those differences have those channels have different values. In some places, being silent has a higher value than in other places where good communicators are meant to talk. And in some cultures, asking questions is equivalent to being polite, whereas in other cultures, you ask the wrong question, it's equivalent to being rude. So that's very much the challenge.
Absolutely. And I agree with you. And in certain cultures, silence, what you mentioned, is for instance, I think in Eastern culture, silence is highly valued, and in Latin cultures, silence is awkward. You wouldn't use, people will be constantly talking on top of each other, and that's considered completely good and very dynamic.
Yeah.
So, but would we kind of, in terms of communication or ineffectiveness in the communication, is it because of our assumptions? I mean, one could be assumptions, and the other could be how people interpret what we say. Do you think interpretations and our assumptions are one of the two of the main problems that cause, ineffective communication?
Yeah, I mean, I think we approach communication with different assumptions. I mean, I think there are a couple of interesting paradigms to explore. Some people communicate with the objective with the priority to complete the task, to get to the result. Some people communicate with the priority to build a relationship in order that the result can be delivered once the relationship in place. And of course, when those two individuals meet with those two very different aims, you have a challenge. Both of the aims are valid, but of course the result-oriented communicator will perceive the relationship-oriented communicator as unprofessional, as wasting time. The relationship-oriented communicator will perceive the task-oriented communicator as rude, impolite, arrogant, uncultured at a certain level. So I think that's a very, very useful basic paradigm. When you open your mouth, what are you trying to do? You're trying to get your results? Are you trying to build a relationship? And then I think within those paradigms, people approach tasks very differently. So you get some communicators, when they open their mouth, they want to do the task, but they want to do the task quickly. They don't want to waste time thinking about it. They want to achieve it. There are other people who are very task-oriented, but they want to analyze to hell before they decide to commit to the task. So when the action-oriented and the analytically oriented meet, although they're both task-oriented, they frustrate each other as well. The analytical guy looks at the action guy and thinks he's unprofessional, he's not planning. And the action guy looks at the analytical guy and says, this guy's not entrepreneurial, he's got no leadership. he's got no ability to take action. And it may seem very simplistic, but I hear those paradigms repeated constantly, almost every day in my clients' offices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And so we've explored some of the challenges or problems with communication. So what's the solution? What are some strategies that individuals in projects, in teams, in virtual teams, in international teams, what are the strategies they could take in order to move towards a more effective communication paradigm?
I think there are a number of things you can do. Of course, one of the most common beliefs that people have is that they're somehow flexible, that they just adapt. I think human beings overestimate their own flexibility and underestimate their own levels of prejudice when others don't communicate in the way they prefer. So, I'm very much in the process of advocating that teams or individuals between their stakeholders, they discuss communication. I think that's a real success factor, to discuss how to communicate, direct, indirect, to discuss when to communicate, frequently, daily, weekly, to discuss when you expect a reply, for example, if you send an email, to discuss the level of information that is expected. Do I send you the full PowerPoint of my presentation to the board tomorrow? Am I expecting you to read through all of that, or do I just send you a few lines in the email just telling you what I'm going to do, giving you a quick briefing? So I think negotiating the style, the frequency, the channel, the level of detail, I think those 4 dimensions, if you can kind of have a discussion around that and at least get an idea of the expectations of your counterpart and come back to that on a regular basis, I think you're more likely to achieve success. And it sounds very simple and obvious, but it's very rarely done. And I see confusions around that escalating to levels of misunderstanding and conflict that eventually can lead to a loss of a lot of money in projects.
Absolutely. So your recommendation is, before the project is initiated, before the initiation process, that individuals sit down and talk about the 4 dimensions of how to communicate during the project. That would
I think it's not something that you achieve once, because in a lot of team buildings at the beginning of projects, you have a kind of a norming process. We set the team charter. Mm-hmm. That is generally quite useless, because people have a euphoria at the beginning of the project, disappear off home, and then start communicating in their own way. So I think it's something you actually need to come back to. I would say on a quarterly basis. My recommendation would be to have a meeting about communication, about the efficiency of the communication processes in the project. And I think that regularity and regular calibration, because again, as you get to know each other, you can be a little bit more direct. As you become more expert with the project, you can send less information. So it's a kind of thing that needs to be calibrated on a regular basis. And also regular calibration avoids frustrations building up.
Absolutely. And in order to avoid rigidity of communication, so if we set a certain style of communication, how can we avoid someone saying, we agreed that we communicate, or the frequency of communication, let's say it's twice a week, but then there's something really urgent, I really need to get this information through, should I wait? Or how do we avoid a kind of a rigidity being built around communication when it's, the communication means are established upfront?
Yeah, that's always the problem with rules, that you put a rule in place and then you meet circumstances that don't fit the rule.
Yeah.
That's the problem with rules. In the sense, they liberate, but they restrict. So you've got to have an intelligent application of rules, and probably an ability sometimes to challenge the rules. It's what I've seen advocated a lot in some project teams, for example. Building on that is the idea that in meetings you always have somebody who disagrees. You have somebody who is given the role to consistently disagree with everybody, which might seem a little bit strange, but actually having that kind of agent provocateur, the one who's constantly challenging the authorities, it allows things to be said and done that wouldn't ordinarily be said. So I think that challenging rules and resetting rules is a very valuable process, but of course it always needs to be done constructively and with some level of integrity. If it's used to undermine the team building process itself and the authority of the leader, then it's a very different kind of suggestion to one which is trying to get the team to a more efficient place. And I guess at the end of the day, that's the responsibility of the leader to understand that motivation behind an individual's challenge.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so you also mentioned about preferences of communication. Is that something that needs to be discussed? Like some cultures and some people prefer a certain style of communication in terms of email, for instance, or and they want, they prefer not to be called on the phone. They prefer everything to be sent on an email. Whereas in some cultures and some individuals prefer, if there's something to be said, then they should, if it's important enough, they should get a phone call or set up a meeting and just discuss it verbally. So how do we kind of navigate through those preferences and in order to communicate more effectively?
You've got various things in play here, actually. Firstly, around virtual communication, you actually have a lot of false beliefs about the relationship between virtual and face-to-face. There's something called media richness theory, which was developed in the 1950s, which made the claim, based upon the communication technology at that time, that face-to-face was a richer form of communication than text-based email communication. In fact, some research now challenges that and indicates that a lot of face-to-face interaction can be less effective than email communication. The communication depends much more on the channel, depends a lot on the relationship and the skill of the individual to use the channel. So first thing to say is that virtual communication is not necessarily less effective. Secondly, then, as you indicated, some individuals prefer virtual for different reasons. Maybe they're very busy, they're mobile, it's not practical for them to be disturbed or to use voice. It's better for them to use text. Some people like to use text because it allows them to express themselves without interruption. The problem with dialogue is that people interrupt you or deny what you're saying. They don't allow you to finish your message. And of course, for non-native speakers, this is very important in international context. Non-native speakers often prefer to use text-based communication. It gives them time to write, to build their message. And they're often really challenged if they suddenly get a phone call from a native speaker idiot who wants to have a face-to-face, wants to have a voice call because he thinks it's more immediate. So I think, again, no rights and wrongs here. I push individuals back, have a discussion, know your own preferences, know the preferences of your counterpart, and come to some kind of negotiation about how to manage it. Mm-hmm. Simple, but it seldom happens.
Absolutely. And I think just being aware, I think aware that everyone has a different preference, at least having that awareness would reduce the frustration, because instead of that person saying, hey, why is this person calling me on the phone, instead of sending an email, they would realize that, well, that's their preferred way of communicating. And so it reduces the level of frustration by having that awareness. Do you think that just not being aware of those preferences could reduce the frustration and increase the effectiveness of communication? Because if you are not as frustrated, you're probably more likely to kind of respond in a positive way to the other person.
Yes, I think keeping that positive attitude is one kind of useful generic piece of advice. I think two other things I notice about communication, or two or three. One is email is overused. I mean, everybody seems to believe that, but there seems to be no end to the overuse of email. And in a similar vein, a similar way, people think that PowerPoint is overused and has become a corrosive process in organizations, that both email and PowerPoint, they look like you're doing something, it looks like you're achieving something and doing the job and ticking off your to-do list. In fact, it just generates more confusion and more inefficiency in organizations by passing the work to other people. And I think that's really important for teams to really to monitor the efficiency and the effectiveness of their communication cycle. Yes, choose your channel, be aware of the preferences, but is what you're doing really effective and necessary? Mm-hmm. And try experiments. And some companies are experimenting now. No email on Friday, no PowerPoints for a week. And the experience of those slightly kind of quirky or unusual experiments are generally very positive. Also, for example, no emails at weekends, to really force people to minimize the email and send only the important ones, and to maintain a sense of work-life balance. So I think playing with some of these fun rules is a way for teams to explore really what is important to communicate, what the best way to do it is, to play with it in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I myself struggle with not being able to use email on the weekend. I can't keep away from that, unfortunately, and it does require a bit of discipline. And I think, in fact, some of these rules also provide opportunity for those who have a preferred communication style to try a different style and become comfortable with it as well. Because if you're restricting one use or one preferred method, and for instance, I think one experiment could be, on a certain day, everyone communicates just verbally. So no email will be sent. You just if you want to say something, communicate it verbally. If it's important, it's because there are times where, and this is one of the issues. It depends on the context or the content of the message, and when, for instance, let's say you need an action to be taken in 2 or 3 weeks' time. It's much better to write that as in an email than just telling someone, okay, can you do this in 3 weeks' time? They're more likely to forget it unless they document it somewhere else. But so it also depends on, I guess, the content as well. Would you say that there should be a kind of a chart or a list of, if this is what you're communicating, this is the style you communicate, and organizations should have a kind of a system in place of, depending on what they want to communicate, how they would communicate it?
I mean, that maybe a personal perspective, that feels a bit over-codified and a bit over-ambitious to regulate communication like that. I think I wouldn't necessarily advocate that, but something you just said I think was very important when you talked about the way in which people send emails to each other with the word urgent in the subject line. So I think I think this is very critical to be aware that when you're working internationally, people in different countries have different workflows to their jobs. They have different moments of urgency locally and different moments when they're relatively lightly tasked. And the problem is that when you suddenly have an urgent task in the UK and I need to email you because it's urgent for me, it may land on your desk at exactly the wrong time for you because you have a local priority. So you simply don't have the time to respond to my urgent email. And I think that structural problem often causes a lot of communication issues. You understand what I'm saying. You just don't have the time to help me. And that means not only do you need to talk about communication protocols, but you need to know really the workflows of your virtual team in all the different countries. I need to know when you're busy. In other words, I need to know when I can't send you urgent emails. And if you can map that, if you have that idea of when you can approach people, when it's good for them, when they're available, I think that can really make communication work more efficiently.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that would, I think that's absolutely right. Like in terms of when it comes to virtual teams, it's very hard to know what the other person is actually doing. You have no physical means of actually knowing what they're up to or what other important matters they're attending to at that very moment. And the fact that something is urgent for you doesn't mean it's going to be urgent for them, depending on that
exactly
technical context. So
Well, it may still be urgent for you, but pragmatically, you're so overloaded with the local task. You know it's urgent, but you cannot help me. You simply don't have the time. And I think that structural piece is often misunderstood, and people often say he's just not helpful. Well, he is helpful. He's just too busy. You asked at the wrong time.
Okay, so we explored a lot of challenges, and we came up with some solutions that we could implement. But I think at the end, would we say that a lot of the challenges or a lot of the issues come from judgment, or premature judgment of situations and of what people are intending to do, or having a more positive attitude would potentially be a better way of communicating effectively?
Yeah, going to be slightly provocative. I think part of the challenge is certainly around the psychic, the intrapersonal, the overuse of assumption, the judgmentalism. But a lot of miscommunication happens because people don't want to communicate. You're sitting there in Australia with your objectives, your targets, your local manager putting pressure on you, and actually you don't really want to help me in my international projects. You're in the project team not because you wanted to be there, but because you were nominated. You're the local representative. And I think we have to realize actually there's a lot of international collaboration where people are not particularly incentivized, or they don't really want to communicate. And this raises a very interesting dilemma then. How do you force people to communicate? And I can ask you, I can be nice to you, I can try to collaborate with you. An alternative is to put pressure on you and to escalate the situation by putting my boss in CC of the email I send you. And of course, people react very, very differently to this. Many people see it as threatening, as kind of ethically unacceptable. Those who are very experienced internationally, I think they use escalation wisely. They know the right moment when the individual isn't cooperating, maybe where there's a systemic problem, and they use authority to get things done. And I think that's a thing that I think inexperienced project leaders struggle with. They don't know when to escalate at the right time and to work through conflict with confrontation. It's a very difficult thing to learn. You kind of learn it by experience rather than through a training course.
Absolutely. And no, I think we've kind of covered a lot of different factors in communication today. Are there any final words you'd like to say in terms of how to more effectively communicate across cross-border?
Well, I think it always comes back to the individual. Know yourself. Mm-hmm. So for the audience watching this piece, I think one takeaway would be go away, do some kind of psychometric profile to understand, to get an idea of how you communicate. You can use the DISC profile, which is a very kind of quick and dirty tool, Myers-Briggs, Insights, team management profile. There are lots of different tools out there that you can use, but I think they're not pure science, but they are very interesting processes to look at your own psychology and your own communication preferences. So you start with yourself first. If you understand your own expectations, you're in a much better position then to share those expectations with another. So that for me would be my big takeaway. And start having conversations over lunch, over dinner, over a coffee about communication, and try to build up your understanding of the wide range of expectations that are out there about how to communicate effectively, because there is no consensus about this.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. So it all starts with the self. Understand oneself. Then once you understand yourself, just get a bit of understanding of those who you're communicating with, what their preferences are, to increase the effectiveness of communication.
Exactly, and make communication a topic of your small talk a little bit. Communication is an endlessly fascinating subject. I've spent 25 years looking at it and I still don't understand it. So start discussing it, start understanding other people's perspectives, because I think that will give you also a degree of mastery of how to handle difficult situations.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Bob, and I think that was a really good session on understanding communication, cross-border communication. And so we look forward to see you again next time for our next session.
Yeah, pleasure, and look forward to the next time.
Thank you, Bob. Goodbye.
Okay, see you then. Bye-bye.
See you soon. Bye.